Welcome back to Boss and Cage, the book club edition. So today we have Kevin again. So those that may have remembered, I think it was like, I don't know, a few weeks ago, maybe about a month or so ago, we had like the Boss and Cage podcast and we interviewed Kevin and I deemed him to be the inner circle boss. But today we get to focus on the inner circle boss book. Innovate the 1%, seven areas to nurture for success. And I kind of stumbled on that because I think I reinvented it a little bit on the title for this episode of saying mastering the seven areas of unleashing success. And it's just kind of like a play on words. So, Kevin, welcome back. I'm looking forward to kind of talk about your book in a different way. And I was just kind of off air talking about like this episodes are like Boston Cage, but is 100% driven towards interviewing more so the book than the person. So, how you doing today?
Absolutely. I am so happy to be back on the show and yeah, happy to dig into this book. And if you want to change the wording around a little bit, I have no problem with that because that's all about innovating.
Which is the key focus of your book. So like let's just start off with like the front cover and work our way in. Now, obviously, the front cover is simple. So those that are maybe looking at it on Amazon, do you have a book at hand that you can kind of pull up to kind of
I
show?
do. Yeah, here's
So
the
I want
front
to talk about that
cover.
concept for a minute. Like, I mean, obviously, a light bulb it is ideas, it's innovation, but in your case, you're talking about multiple light bulbs, and only one light bulb is lit up. So, like, what's the concept behind the book, the actual cover?
Yeah, so the cover, I do tend to be a bit literal
Mhm.
a lot of times. So innovate the 1%. The title and the image really go hand in hand. Originally, I was thinking about having 100 light bulbs with only one lit up, so it would be that one light bulb, out of 100.
Mhm.
But then it just got too cluttered, on the book cover. So I just, have this band of light bulbs. But again, only one is lit up because that is to signify the 1%. And that's really where the title came from,
Mhm.
which is in the work that I was doing where so many of my patents came to be. I was responsible for receiving disclosures from surgeons. So a disclosure is a formal communication of an idea, and I would document it, write it down, log it in. And what it turned out is in the 7+ years that I was at this company accepting disclosures, I received over 400 disclosures from surgeons, but only four of those ideas actually turned into marketed products. So
Mhm.
that's 1% of the ideas that came through turned into real products. And that's why I use that as the title,
Mhm.
because most ideas just do not turn into real products. So
So,
that's the title and the cover.
so coming from you, I mean, obviously, I think the last time we talked, we corrected. I think I had said 75 patents, but you're more like 80 patents. So, like, obviously, you're really big into innovation, right? So, when you're talking about the 1%, like, usually when we hear the 1%, we think about, okay, there's broke people, there's middle class, there's wealthy, and then there's the top 1% ultra wealthy. But in your book, you're not necessarily referring to that. So I want you to kind of to define what and who is actually part of that 1% you're communicating to.
Well, the 1% is not necessarily the people I'm communicating to, but it's the idea that very, very few ideas actually are worthy of turning into that really come out to the public, that come out to the market, that most ideas just suck. That's really what it comes down to. And that was going to be the title. It was going to be something like 99% of ideas suck. But I thought that was just a little bit too negative. Um, but really, it's this idea that innovation it doesn't just happen all the time. It's not easy to innovate. It's not easy to just come up with something that's completely revolutionary and new that works. And but it's possible, and you can cultivate certain areas, which is 7 areas that I've landed on,
Mhm.
but you can cultivate these areas so that you can actually have a higher percentage of ideas that will really work and solve a problem. But it's just very few ideas really turn into something valuable in the world. And that's okay too, because we have to get through all of the not so good ideas to find those real gems
Mhm.
that are, innovative.
I think that kind of, let's just crack the spine open a little bit. So, like in the forward, if I could summarize the forward a little bit, and I want you to talk about how did you meet that individual. In the forward, he was essentially saying that innovation on demand can be difficult to achieve, right?
Definitely.
Right. But in addition to that, creating a culture that supports emotional health and innovation is key to success. So there's kind of like there's a serious duality. And I want you to kind of unpack that a little bit. And also I want you to talk about like how did you actually meet the person to write you forward?
Um, well, let's talk about the person first. So Fritz, Michael Fritzius, is a gentleman that I met at a conference called NLV, which stands for No Longer Virtual. And he and I, this was in 2019, and we just, met at this small conference that's put on by Sarah Elkins. And it's really about getting beyond the keyboard and meeting in person. And it was just a really intense, fun, insightful opportunity to meet. It was about 50 people at this conference, and that's where we met and we really hit it off. He was providing um, a small session for the group. Well, he provided a regular session for the group. It was like 45 minutes long. I was providing a little micro session that was like 15 to 20 minutes long, and he attended my little micro session, which was actually centered around emotional health and innovation. And basically, there were like 8 people at my table, because there were several tables and you could choose which table you wanted to go to for the little micro session. And he was at my table, and I basically kind of blew the mind on everybody at the table around this concept of emotional health, a different definition of emotional health. A lot of people define emotional health in terms of managing your emotions. But that to me is that you can look it up. That's the definition for emotional intelligence, which is also important but different. So, in terms of emotional health and really feeling loved and valued and not judged and not shamed, and how that kind of environment really drives innovation, kind of blew all of their minds. And it was funny because when the micro session ended, I was like mid sentence, and when Sarah called out, like, okay, it's time to switch tables, everyone at my table was like, no, because they didn't want to stop, because they wanted to keep going. And it turned out that they asked, can we just stay at Kevin's table for another round and keep digging in? And they actually did, and a couple more people came and joined that table. But it was that was the NLV conference. That's where I met Fritz. And that's where this combination of emotional health and innovation go together, which I really dive into in chapter 2 of the book, which is all about relationships. And if we don't feel like we can share a terrible idea, if we don't feel comfortable doing that because we're going to be judged or shamed, or we're going to be fired for a bad idea, that just completely stifles innovation. So, Fritz and I have been friends ever since that conference. And yeah, and he offered to write the forward, and I'm like, sure, that'd be fantastic. I would love that. Thank you.
So, I mean, book writing, I mean, obviously, there's always an issue of trying to establish a team unless you've written multiple books and then you can kind of just pick up the phone and send out an email. So, what you're saying is that he offered. Is that something that you think is pretty regular in book writing, or is it something that you just lucked up and happened to come across?
Yeah, I lucked out, I hadn't even really thought very much about a forward.
Mhm.
I just wanted to get these ideas, out of my head. Um, and I had actually about a year before, um, Fritz and we were sort of doing our own little mastermind group where we were both writing our book.
Mhm.
And I kind of inspired him to write his book.
Mhm.
and then he ended up writing his book, and I ended up not writing my book.
Mm.
And then a year later, I actually got to writing my book, and then he offered to write the foreword, and I'm like, oh my God. And I think he was also doing it because he was so grateful and thankful that I helped encourage him, plant the seed and encourage him
Mm.
to write his book. So I think it was also a bit of a, reciprocity there as well.
So I mean, I think it was a hell of a segue. I mean, obviously, like we're talking about the forward of the book, and you kind of jumped to chapter two, which is a hell of a segue because I mean, the title of that chapter is "You Can't Build in Quicksand," but it's essentially about poor relationships, strong relationships, and exactly what you're talking about. So I want you to kind of talk, like, why did you choose that to be chapter two versus like maybe right after the intro? Because I mean, you're talking about establishing the relationships to understand what it looks like to then develop a concept to be part of that 1%. So like why would that number two?
Yeah, it's that's such a great question. Like, how do you order your book, and what comes first? And you know, for me, so now I'm going to talk about chapter one. So I'm just not going to talk about what you want to talk about.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's funny because chapter one is titled "The Horse Goes in Front of the Cart." And what I have seen in my career is so often people are coming up with solutions and trying to find a problem where that solution fits.
Mm,
And that just, it doesn't really work very well. My experience has shown it just doesn't work that well. But when you identify the problem first, then you solve the problem. And without a problem, you're not going to innovate anything, really. I mean, just to innovate, you can come up with ideas, but typically ideas and innovation is there to solve a problem. That's why we change things. There's some kind of stressor, some kind of tension that we want to alleviate, and that's where the solution comes in, and that's why we need to innovate, because anything else that's already there isn't working. But if we start with some really interesting idea or solution, well, if there's no problem that you're fixing, then why do you even have that in the first place? Why have a new idea in the first place? There's something, I find that something is going to spark, something is going to be the catalyst on why you're coming up with a solution. And if you don't have a problem to address, then it's just like wasted time, wasted energy. So that's why the first chapter is all about, you got to start with a problem. What's the tension? What's the issue? What's the challenge? What's the discomfort? What is the pain that we're having? And then once you can really identify the true root problem, then the solutions tend to be incredibly easy to come by. And that's
mm,
what I have found in my career. So that's why chapter one is, if you don't have a problem first, there's nothing to really solve and innovate and bring to the market or bring to society.
mm,
Um, but then once you do have that problem, trying to solve a problem in a silo, and by silo, I mean by yourself, it's
mm.
possible. Of course, it's possible. But man, do things just seem to go so much better, faster, more efficient when you've got at least one other person, or a team, even better, to rally and offer a bunch of different ideas, and to do that in an environment where there's complete emotional safety. I'm not talking about mental, psychological safety. I mean, psychological means mental and emotional. um I don't think it's really a mental issue, because my definitions are very different for
Yeah.
mental and emotional. For me, mental is all about your cognitive ability, your reasoning, your decision making ability. Emotional is how you feel with other people, how loved and connected and sense of belonging you feel with other people. And when you feel a true sense of love and belonging with others, I just got a great, wonderful, deep breath of like life, and when you've got that kind of energy bouncing back and forth, that really positive, constructive energy bouncing back and forth, it's like everybody's energy is vibrating at a higher frequency. And that to me, and that's what I've learned in my career, is when the magic really happens. That's when the ideas start flying. And sure, most of the ideas are terrible and don't work, but it's by going back and forth where I might have a horrible idea, but my colleague can spin my bad idea into something wonderful, and then things really take off.
So I
So
mean, I
that's
think it's
chapter one
interesting
and
that
two.
like we started off with like the forward, right? And we jumped into chapter two, then jumped into chapter one. So I pull it back to the preface a little bit. And I think that's what you're talking about essentially. And I can summarize this, right? Like many people are dreaming of hitting a particular jackpot, right? Right? They're looking for the
That's so
million
true.
dollar idea, right?
Yeah, just like, oh, I'll just come up with a million idea on Tuesday between 2 and 4 p.m. at a brainstorming session.
But in reality, what you're saying is there's first of all you have to establish the problem. Second of all, then you have to establish a relationship to kind of feed off that problem to figure out if that problem is a viable problem to then create the solution. So I want you to kind of talk about like going into the preface. And again, you have 80 patents. So again, you're spitting out ideas and you're creating ideas and you're developing them at a scale that the average person can't even comprehend. So I want to talk about like how does that work in your mind versus someone that's new coming into that space?
Yeah, so oh my gosh, there was so much great stuff in what you said, and I can't even remember all of it right off the top. But cultivating that environment where you can just spew out ideas wherever they come from and bounce these ideas off each other. Um, the environment that was created by, I'd say, by our senior management, by our CEO and by my boss, who was the vice president of engineering and really like the number two person at the company. They really trusted me, and I felt really valued. I could do whatever I really wanted to do.
Mhm.
I would go weeks at a time without even talking to my boss, and I would just identify problems that I was seeing in the industry. And this is by attending surgery, by talking to surgeons, by talking to sales reps, um, by talking to the marketing department. Like, what problems are they having? And being in an environment where my superiors trusted me and believed in me, like without question, they just let me do what I wanted to do.
Mhm.
And then with my team, we could just start identifying problems and solving them. And we just did it day in and day out. And that's all that we did. And and that's really where the magic was happening. The environment that the bosses created, senior management created, and then I was director, of the
Mhm.
research and advanced development group. And then my team, where we were all equal. We were all valuable. I mean, we had different jobs and there was like, a hierarchy, like I was the boss of the department, but it was no problem if I came up with a terrible idea. I mean, there was one time where I'd been working on something in my commute. I had like a 75-minute commute each way to work. And I was working on this problem and I'm like, oh my God, I have it figured out. And I spent like 75 minutes in deep, deep thought while driving. And as soon as I got to the office, I was like, Larry, that was my designer. I was like, Larry, oh my God, I figured out how we're going to solve this. And before I even like put my lunch in the refrigerator and took off my coat, I'm drawing on the whiteboard and I'm like drawing this really detailed design. I've got it all figured out. I spend like 10 minutes drawing it all out. And then Larry looks at me and he's like, all right, I see what you're doing, but what about that right there? That doesn't work there. And I'm like, oh my God, you're right. It totally doesn't work. This is a total failure. And I just erased the whole thing. and we went about our day, and I was his boss. I'm a couple years younger than him. I have a master's degree in biomedical engineering, and he has an associate's degree in drafting. And he felt incredibly comfortable to point out my blatant blunder error. And I was like, okay, you're right. It doesn't work. Let's just start over. And that's okay. That's what I mean by having those kind of relationships
Mhm.
where you're not a bad person because you have a bad idea. And just because, you have the degree and the hierarchy and whatever doesn't, and just because you're younger, it's about the relationships and how you feed off each other and how you value each other as people. And I'll just even throw this in there. This is why diversity, equity, inclusion is so important in the workplace, because if you don't have ideas coming from different places, from different perspectives, you're not going to innovate. That's why DEI is so important. You got to have different perspectives. Larry is an associate degree in drafting. He doesn't have the formal engineering background. He's older. He's a real hands-on, tear apart my car engine, put it back together. It's that perspective. That's why we had such a great balance back and forth. And I had a friendship and an incredible working relationship. It all boils down to that. Having that kind of foundation, to me, is just the most critical part of innovating.
So I'm going to play on words right here, right? So observing keenly, seeing things from a different perspective kind of plays directly into your subchapter of chapter one, digging deeper. And that's pretty much what you just summarized, right? Like
Yeah.
like you're diving deeper into relationships, you're diving deeper into the problems to find the solutions. So I want you to kind of talk about, like, in the writing process, there's always going to be a problem, right? Prime example, we talked about your chapter names, but like just talk about your subchapters. Like one of them is called digging deeper, which is part of chapter one. The other
Mhm.
one is called problem solved. Like, how did you come up with those names, and why didn't you just write the chapter? Why did you have to have subchapters?
Well, I mean, each chapter has a theme, I mean, you could, this is my first book, so it might not even be that coherent. It's almost like a series of 7 blog posts, basically. Each chapter is like its own little blog post. But as I was coming up with the whole idea for this book, which actually happened in the middle of the night, I woke up like with a dream with a vision of the book, and I just started talking to my Google speaker and telling ideas. Is like 1 o'clock in the morning or something. Um, but it all just kind of occurred to me, like, what key elements was I pulling from in, like, background, personality, interaction with people? What was really the driving force behind some of these patents, some of these innovations that turned into really big marketed products that saved lots of lives, that made, billions of dollars in revenue? And that's where the chapters came from.
Mhm.
And it's always frustrated me for so long about, having solutions in search of a problem. Like, I feel like artificial virtual reality and augmented reality, I feel like a lot of that is a solution in search of a problem. I mean, if you're doing augmented reality and you're thumbing through a screen of the anatomy, well, doctors have already been doing an incredible job learning anatomy using Gray's Anatomy, which is just this like 3.5 inch thick paperback book. Um, they've learned anatomy just fine from a book and from cadaver. So what is the real problem that augmented reality for cadaver and medicine, what is that really solving? Maybe someone will find a real problem that it solves, but I don't really see that. There are so many other problems out there, like, I don't know, cancer, diabetes, you know obesity. Like, these are problems right in our face, and I'm working on augmented reality just to learn anatomy. We already solved that. I mean, it's already done very, very well. Does that
Mhm.
make does that make sense? So
Yeah, yeah, and I
that's
think
the
it's a hell of a
chapter
segue,
one.
right? I think it's a hell of a segue for chapter 3, right? I mean, the title of that chapter is "Accountants Don't Do Heart Surgery." So it's funny that you brought up Grey's Anatomy. So I want you to, like, spitting off of that, I want you to kind of summarize chapter 3 based upon what you just said.
Yeah, so chapter 3, accountants don't do heart surgery. This is where, when you are a subject matter expert,
Mhm,
the more you know about a particular subject matter, the
mhm,
better you're going to be able to identify problems and solve those problems.
mhm,
Okay. And the reason, the reason I think that the surgeons had such terrible ideas, generally speaking, right? Because there were over 400 disclosures and only 1% turned into
mhm,
ideas. The ideas that me and my team were coming up with did not get logged as formal disclosures. So in that 7.5 years, my name is added to like 75 plus patents. Some of my patents are from a different company, different subject matter. Um, so the ratio was much higher, which you alluded to earlier. Well, as an engineer, all we were doing day in and day out was solving problems, identifying and solving problems. Whereas surgeons, they are meeting with patients, diagnosing, doing surgery, getting up to speed, reading all the publications on all the different diseases that they need. I mean, they have such a larger breadth of subject matter and different area subject matter that they need to address on a day-to-day basis. So for them to come up with a solution, like a technical instrument or implant solution, that's just a very small part of what they can do or what
mhm.
they're even doing in a day-to-day basis. Their subject matter expertise is disease and trying to address the disease and listen to the patient. Whereas as engineers, our job is identify a problem or have someone tell us what a problem is and then fix it, solve it. So that's what we did day in and day out. Surgeons, that's not what they do. So that's why chapter 3 is so important, where I was digging into all of the, materials and strength of materials and how do you sterilize, the instruments and the implants and what's the manufacturing procedure. That's everything that we dig into,
Mhm.
and that's why I think why we were able to come up with so many solutions, because we were only focusing on the solution, whereas like the surgeons are focusing on all these other areas of medicine, not just the implants. Does that make sense?
It definitely makes sense, and I think it's just so funny the way this episode is unfolding because I'm in your first like 2 sentences, you pretty much defined your chapter 4. You said the more you know, right? So it's kind
Right.
of like I want you to kind of then unpack that a little bit because I mean, obviously you're talking about surgeons, you're talking about like they're different than what the engineers are doing. Both of them are highly skilled, highly informed. So I want you to kind of talk about what is your meaning behind the more you know, and then on the flip side, I want you to talk about is it ever knowing too much a bad thing?
Well, so you're totally dialing in. So like chapter 3 is all about being that subject matter expert and really knowing that area, that subject really, really well. But then chapter 4 is almost like the opposite, because it's all about the more you know, which is having access to as much information as you possibly can, because all of that gets,
Yeah.
all of that feeds into your subconscious, and then it all mixes together. So they sort of seem like counterintuitive, like they're opposites of each other. So what can happen is the deeper you dive into a subject matter area, um, then you can lose sight of everything else. But with chapter 4, if you can if you can know about all kinds of different subject matter areas, then you can pull from different areas and apply them to where you need them
Mm.
to solve that problem in your area of expertise. So, like one of my favorite things in chapter 4, I talk about um, a particular pedicle screw design, and I actually happen to have it, and I'll show it up to the screen. So this is a pedicle screw. It goes into your spine, and it's a very different kind of pedicle screws. So these threads go into your vertebral bodies. Okay. And on this screw, there's a little lip right here. See this little lip?
Yep.
Can you see that? Okay. So this was a patent that my company had purchased from some other company, and they wanted to turn it into something, but the engineering team was struggling. Like they couldn't figure out how to make this design. It didn't exactly look like this from the patent, but how to make this design work. And I was only a couple days new to the company. And they're like, hey, Kevin, we're struggling with this. We just thought we'd see if you had any ideas, on this design. And because we're really stuck. And I won't tell the whole story. You can read about it in the chapter. But basically, the problem is the instruments were really, really big and bulky,
Mhm.
and you couldn't get the instrument into the surgical area because of the anatomy, and then you couldn't lock the screw with the rod that goes in that screw. So they came to me. They're like, "Hey, do you have any ideas?" I was like, "All right, I'll take a look at it. I'll give it a shot." And I had this idea, this memory of my mom's potted plant hanging in the kitchen growing up. And the potted plant it was hanging from the ceiling, and it had these three little fake plastic rope. It looked like rope, but it was just plastic, like spiral, and it hooked the lip of the pot. And
Mhm.
that's how this potted plant was hanging from the ceiling. And I was like, oh, if we could just hook the lip of this screw, that lip that I was showing you earlier,
Mhm.
if we could just hook that with the instrument, then we can move it almost a centimeter, almost like 10 millimeters up and out of the wound, so we could get away from the anatomy and get the instrument. And then we redesigned the instrument a little bit, but that was actually not a problem to do. And now we were 10 millimeters about outside the wound, away from the bony anatomy, and the whole project just took off. By the
Mhm.
next day, the designer who was working on it took this lip idea that I had come up with, added it, put this beautiful bowl shape to the bottom half here of the head of the screw, and the whole project took off from that point on. So that's chapter 4. Is I had a memory from my mom's potted plant in the kitchen, and I turned that idea and I applied it to a pedicle screw for the spine, and and then we got a bunch of patents for that, and instrument patents, and so on and so forth. And now this particular screw, so we're already well into 2023, but as of October of 2020, this pedicle screw has been implanted 1 million times in people around the world, and it's still being sold today. And back when I was at the office at that company, this pedicle screw sold for $1,400 per screw. So, I mean, there's a lot of work that goes into making this. Just cutting the metal is only like, $80, or I think it's down to like $50 now, just to cut the metal, titanium. But all the work that went in to, bringing this to market, that's why it's $1,400 per screw. So that's $1.4 billion in MSRP revenue just from this one patent
Yeah.
that I helped create. And it wasn't just me, it was the team. I came up with the lip, but then the designer turned that, and I figured out how big the lip needs to be so it's not going to shear off.
Mhm.
But then the designer turned it into added the lip in the right area, and then this beautiful bowl shape so it wouldn't interfere with anatomy, came up with the instrument. So it's a team effort. It's a
Mhm.
total team effort. But that's why chapter 4 is so important, because I'm pulling from a potted plant in my mom's kitchen and turning it into, or applying it to, a spinal implant that's been implanted in well more than a million times.
I swear to the listener, like none of this was scripted. We just kind of just like, this is what I want to talk about. We're going to talk about the book, but metaphorically, the next chapter falls into what you just said as well. I mean, you were at a point to where you were stuck. and you look to the ceiling to get a pot. And the next chapter is called glass ceiling. I'm sitting here listening to you, and I'm just like, did he do this intentionally or just like
No.
subconsciously? So like the whole, you just kind of defined the glass ceiling a little bit, but I want you to kind of to break that apart. I mean, you gave a literal example of being at a particular plateau and then literally looking for something, literally looked at the ceiling, found your answer, and then created this whole new product, broke the glass ceiling, and then like you said, the project took off. These are your words. So I want you to talk about chapter 5 a little bit.
That is so funny. I had never even made that connection of the potted plant in the ceiling with the glass ceiling chapter title. I've That's all new to me. I hadn't even thought about that. That's you're coming up with, you're seeing it, that you're seeing what I'm not seeing. So that's beautiful. Um, so the glass ceiling is really about, it's really about, believing that you can, well, is that the other chapter? No, this is the chapter. Okay, I'm getting confused myself now. So it's believing that you can solve these problems.
Mm,
It's it's removing these limitations that we have on ourselves and that
mm,
we put on others. We grow up so often telling our kids, no, you can't do that. Don't do that. It doesn't work that way. This is how it is. Well, I'll tell you, you can look back through history, and most everything that we believed to be 100% true and factual has turned out to be completely false.
mm,
And that's what I mean by breaking the glass ceiling and moving beyond your belief system and these limiting beliefs that we so often place on kids, place on students, place on our employees, place on ourselves. And until we believe and believe that something is possible, right? No one thought you could land a rocket booster back on, planet Earth. It's always been, the rocket boosters go up into space and they're gone and they're just space trash from now on. But Elon Musk or somebody at Elon Musk's team at SpaceX believed, you know what, we can salvage this, we can repurpose this, we don't have to just throw it away. That's what I mean by breaking through the glass ceiling. Like, all because that's what we've done all along doesn't mean we should keep doing it. If it's not working, if there's a reason, again, back to identify the problem, space travel is so expensive because so much of it's just throw it away, right? The rocket just, until the space shuttle came along, mostly the rocket, except for the top little, capsule, you just chuck everything. So you're just chucking billions and billions of dollars.
mm.
So that's what the glass ceiling is all about. And even back to the example with this screw, it's called the Mesa screw, by the way. But even back to that screw, the idea was, we're confined by what the current head, it's actually called the tulip. Um, this whole bulbous area up here is called the tulip, or the head of the screw. Um, you know, when we received the patent, or when we purchased the patent, the original patent, it didn't have this kind of lip. And I'm like, well, what if we just added it? You know, in manufacturing, you're typically cutting metal away.
Mm.
You don't usually add material. But I'm like, well, what if we just start and add material? Start with a bigger block, and now the material's there. It's okay to think outside the box. If you think within the box, you're confined, you're constrained, and that's why we continue to struggle solving problems. I
Mm.
mean, I'll take it to another level. Um, a typical, I'm just looking for my material. This is what a typical screw on the market looks like. You've got the rod, and you've got a set screw
Mhm.
that locks the rod to the tulip. Okay. Well, when you've got this big honking amount of material above the rod, when you're talking about smaller and thinner patients, you can literally feel the screws on their back. You can feel it. But with the Mesa screw, when you put the rod in, there's nothing above the rod. So the profile is just so much lower, and that's better for all kinds of different reasons, okay? Well, then we ran into this problem where we needed, not we, the surgeons needed a stronger rod, a stiffer rod, spinal rod, because in some of these really difficult deformity patients, the rod would kind of flatten out. You know, there's a natural curve that the surgeon wants to match the curve of the spine, but it flattens out, and they can even bend or break completely. Like a cobalt chrome rod. I don't have just a rod out, but this is a titanium rod, but it's just a 5.5 millimeter diameter titanium rod. Okay, and you can make them out of cobalt chrome, which is a much stiffer, heavier, harder material. And even those would break. Even in a 12-year-old girl, they can break. So the next option in the spinal industry would be to go to a 6.35 millimeter rod. That's a 1/4 inch diameter rod, because it's so much larger, it's harder to break. Well, to do that, you know, we have to design a completely new system, all new instruments. You can't mix stainless steel and titanium. There's so many problems, so much money, so much inventory, regulatory, you know, FDA approval. There's just so much headache. I'm like, I don't want to do that. So I happen to be walking by the conference room, thinking about this problem, thinking about the struggle that the surgeon is having, thinking about the 12-year-old girl who broke her bilateral rods in her spine. And I'm like, we got to fix this. So then I'm like, well, going beyond our limiting beliefs that it has to be a circular rod, and a circular rod is only going to work in this kind of implant, which is the entire market has this kind of a pedicle screw implant. But we at K2M, which is now Stryker, has this kind of implant. So I was like, what if we just go above the screw head and make a rod that looks more like an I-beam construction? It fits the same screw head, but it's got more material above the rod. It's still much lower profile than than a typical screw, right? Can you see that? Does that?
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah.
So this, by thinking outside the box and removing that glass ceiling that the rods have to be circular, we designed this, and it just addressed. We didn't have to design. I didn't have to, but we didn't have to make a whole stainless steel system. We didn't have to go to a much larger screw. We didn't have to build out all this inventory. These were deformity sets. So a deformity instrument set is like 6 tubs of instruments versus a regular degenerative spine instrument set, which is only 3 sets. So it's like doubling the amount of instruments because it's so much more complicated. It costs so much less money. The regulatory path through the FDA is so much easier. The testing is easier. The financing is easier. Like, it just solves like it hits every box. And that goes back to the earlier chapter about knowing your industry and knowing your subject matter. When I came up with this idea for this I-beam construction, I was like, wow, it works for finance, production, regulatory, testing, engineering. It works better for the hospital staff, because now they have fewer tubs to deal with. It's better for cleaning, so it's better for central supply at the hospital. It's better for intraoperative surgical variation, for lack of a better word, because now the surgeon has more options during surgery, because they're not constricted to just a 6.35 millimeter screw design. They can take the Mesa screw. They can use a round 5.5 titanium, a round 5.5 cobalt chrome, a rail. That's what we ended up calling this rod, the rail. They can do that in titanium. They can do it in cobalt chrome. All of these work with the same screw. So now the surgeon only has to deal with this one screw to put in. and then they can choose whatever rod style they want that's going to meet the patient need. It just works on every level. But if we weren't thinking outside the box,
Mhm.
you're stuck. You're constrained. You have to go to a 6.35 millimeter rod. That's what the whole market does. And you still look around today, this is 10 years later, and that's still what every other final implant manufacturer does. They're still working inside the box,
I
and they
think
still have that limiting belief.
for me, like listening to you speak and hearing how passionate you are, and it's kind of like like there was a couple times I wanted to interrupt and say something. I was like, no, I can't because like you're still building such a great segue to the next chapter, which is essentially riding the brainwave. And I think that you were in that state of mind. Like the way you were explaining it, the way you were diving into it, you were personifying the next chapter. So I was like, I'm just going to let him do it. And at the end, I'm going to bring it all together. Right. So I want you to kind of talk about like that state of mind that you were in. Like you were passionate. You were talking about it solved all the problems for the doctors and nurses, and you're listing all these things off and you're showing them and you're animated and the energy is oozing through it. You consider that riding on the wave.
Yeah, that is actually because I had when I came up with that idea, I was at my marketing counterpart. I was in her office and she was like literally crying because she felt so bad for the patients, the young girls who have these implants who were bending these 5.5 cobalt chrome rods or breaking them completely. Um, she felt so deeply for these patients, and then the challenges and frustrations that the surgeons who we work with, um, the challenges that they're having. She just wants to help people. That's why she's doing the work that she does also. And I'm just thinking about, God, this is such a huge problem in the whole market, in the whole industry. And I'm like, God, we've got to fix this. We've got to fix this. And I'm kind of just zoning out, walking back to my office, and I happen to be walking by the conference room, and I'm like, and it just hit me. So I was really kind of just zoning out, like, here's the problem, here's the problem, here's the problem, and then boom, the light bulb goes off. And that's how your subconscious works. And when you're sort of zoning out,
Mm-hmm.
when you're sort of not all there, um, then that's when your brain goes into this theta wave pattern. And where it also happened for me in the example I read about in the book is when I happened to, you know, not happen, it was so often that again, my designer Larry would be in my office and he's drawing on the whiteboard. It's like 2 in the afternoon, and I'm just like falling asleep. I got my feet up on my desk. I'm just like, I'm listening, but I'm like really about to fall asleep. I'm like in and out, right? I'm like half asleep, half awake, but I'm listening in some respect. But my brain is dropping out of high beta, which is where we're like working really hard and we're thinking really hard on something, or even low beta, where we're at a meeting and we're listening and we're paying attention. It drops into theta, which is a brainwave, right? And that's the brainwave when you're like half asleep, half awake. And it's when you can kind of bridge from your subconscious mind to your conscious mind, which I'm going to my frontal lobe here. And your subconscious mind is basically, it has a record of everything that's ever happened to you in your entire life. And when you can pull from your subconscious and bring it forward to your conscious mind, that's what happens or can happen in theta. And that's when the idea, so Larry might be drawing on the whiteboard and I'm falling asleep, and then boom, I come out of it and I'm like, here it is. This is what we can do here. And that is riding the brainwave. It's like, let yourself doze off, which of course, 90%, I'm just pulling that number out of the air, but 90% of bosses like, what, you can't fall asleep at work. You better get to work harder, do this, do that. If you don't have an opportunity to let your brain really relax,
Mm.
then these incredible ideas and epiphanies and innovations and insights are going to really struggle to get from your subconscious to your conscious. And that to me is when so many of the wonderful ideas come about, because again, we know from the neuroscience, 95% of our actions and behaviors come from our subconscious.
Mm-hmm.
If we try to think our way through every single thing, that's only 5% of our brain. The 95% is almost always going to override the 5%. And this is why I think the mental health industry is such a problem, which I do talk about back in chapter 5 with the glass ceiling. I think the reason why the mental health industry struggles to deal with addiction, depression, anxiety, suicide, gun violence, whatever, is because they still haven't identified and focused on the true root problem. They're still trying, in my opinion, the mental health industry is still trying to force our way to controlling everything. And if
Mhm.
you can't control everything, then your brain must be broken. And I think that's what's wrong with the mental health industry, because again, we know from the neuroscience that 95% of our actions and behaviors are subconsciously controlled. We don't consciously control most of our behaviors. So that's kind of the bridge, and going back to the chapter 5 about limiting beliefs, is we're still operating under this false belief that we're in control of everything that we do, when in reality, we're only in control of about 5% of what we do.
So let me just recap going into the last chapter. Right? I mean, chapter 1, the horse goes in front of the cart, essentially is establishing the problem, right? And then
Mhm.
you're talking about you can't build in quicksand is essentially establishing the relationships, being the accountant and not the heart surgeon per se, kind of being specialized in what you know and what you're doing. Then you're going
Mhm.
into the more you know, right? It's just kind of like once you establish whether you're going to be the accountant or the surgeon, you have to embrace whatever that environment is and grow. Then you're
Mhm.
talking about breaking through the problem, like shattering through the glass ceiling to what you said earlier about, looking up and seeing the pot and finding that problem. And then you're talking about riding the waves. Like once you're in that problem and you're starting to establish whatever that solution is, your brain then kind of goes into this theta stage to where like information just oozes out of you. And
Yeah, and you get into that flow state.
yeah. And then last but not least, I think it's a phenomenal chapter to close on. It's the action. It's taking the action. And the last chapter is strike while the iron's hot.
Wow. I just got chills when you said that. Because you've got to take action. And, so often, I can't even tell you how many times I'll think of something in the middle of the night, if something comes to me and I'm like, oh my God, this is gold. Like, I'm totally going to remember this. There's no way I could possibly forget this. This is such an incredible idea. And then morning comes and I don't even remember that I had an idea overnight. So if I don't write it down, if I don't talk to my Google speaker now in the middle of the night, if we don't take action when we're inspired and when that idea comes to us, if we don't really nurture it, at least to get it off the ground a little bit, then so often we just lose it. And the story from that final chapter is where a surgeon, this is one of the 4 ideas that a surgeon brought to K2M. He had an idea while he was mountain biking. He was literally flying down the hill on a mountain bike, and he had this idea for a screw-based retractor, which I have one here. This is what it turned into. It's plastic, it's flexible. And the way it works is it goes into the spine through just a stab wound like this, and it would look like this in the spine. So in your back, it looks like this. But he had this idea while mountain biking for a screw-based retractor, and he wrote it down. He formally disclosed it to us, to me, and it turned into, like it's hard to see it here, but you can like see the screw. I don't know if you can see the top of the screw through that, but this basically changed the way minimally invasive spine surgery is done around the world, because he had this idea, he wrote it down, he shared it with someone, and then me and my team turned it into, we believed in his vision. We believed like, okay, I could see, I had a vision of how this is possible, and we ran with it and we turned it into a completely new way of doing spine surgery, minimally invasive spine surgery. And the funniest part of this whole invention, this whole innovation, is that when we were demonstrating it for the very first time at a conference, where surgeons would come by, the first question that every surgeon asked was, well, how do you get the rod in? Okay, so this gets into the weeds and kind of the details, but the spinal rod is, that connects down the spine. And for minimally invasive spine surgery, getting a rod in is like the most difficult part. And that's why minimally invasive spine surgery was so difficult up until this point. And I'm like, what do you mean? How do you get the rod in? You just put it in. They're like, no. Like, what's the trick? What's the gimmick? What's the tool? How do you do this? And again, this goes back to the glass ceiling issue. It's always been a problem, like getting the rod in, but by completely flipping around how you do minimally invasive spine surgery with a screw-based retractor that's flexible like this from the top, getting the rod in is you just put the rod on a regular rod inserter and you just stick it in like that. And the surgeons are like, oh my God. And I'm like, here, you do it. Because we had these little models of the spine and the back and everything that you could do it, on a tabletop. We didn't have cadavers in the conference or anything like that. And their minds were blown. The glass ceiling would just shatter because we completely removed the problem, the original problem. We just took it out of the equation. And now we shatter the glass ceiling. It's no problem to get the rod in. That used to be the most difficult part of the surgery, of minimally invasive surgery. Now it's the easiest part of minimally invasive surgery, because we struck while the iron was hot. The surgeon had the idea, and we turned it into something while removing the original problem for minimally invasive surgery. It all kind of comes together.
So, I mean, collectively, right? I mean, obviously, you're establishing a lot of different insights in this book. It's not necessarily a big, thick book. It's a short book that has a lot of information in it. So, I want you to talk about like the other side of the coin. I mean, most people that are writing a book can kind of become a lead magnet. It can be an education tool. How does this book then tie into your platform? Like, is there an association between them? Is it essentially a lead magnet? And if it isn't, like, how are you progressing by writing the book and then growing your business at the same time?
Wow, that's such a great question. I'll be perfectly honest with you. I have not done a great job, marketing or using this book to generate more business. I'd like it to, but I haven't been doing that. But what I would like to do is I would love for people to read the book, managers, teachers, read the book and be like, wow, it doesn't have to be, innovation doesn't have to be so difficult. Innovation isn't just for the crazy Einsteins and Elon Musk and Bill Gates of the world. Anybody can innovate. And what I've learned is if you cultivate any one or more of these 7 areas, then you can start innovating too. You can start really creatively problem solving, which is a big topic in schools, whether it's secondary school or university level. But it's a huge challenge in the workplace. The workplace managers want people who can creatively problem solve, but one, they don't create an environment where that's conducive, right? But also most people struggle. I mean, I'm I've got the gray hair. I've been around the block a few times. I've been in industry for a while, and I'll tell you, kids coming out of school, you give them a blank sheet of paper and a problem, they don't know what to do. They are lost. You give them a problem to solve, where there's no friction and there's no heat loss, it's a perfect environment, which is never the real world. They can do amazing things solving that problem. Most of the people who I've ever worked with in engineering had better GPAs in college than I had, but none of them are innovating the way I have innovated, because it's not just about the book smart, it's about all of these other things. Did I talk about grades in this? Did I talk about what classes you took in this book? No. Did I talk about what school you went to or what your major
Mm,
was in this book? No, because in my opinion, none of that stuff really matters.
mm,
If you go back to the chapter about accountants don't do heart surgery, if you're interested in a topic, I don't care what the topic is. If it's video games, if you're interested in that topic, you are going to learn everything. Humans are naturally curious. You're going to learn everything there is about that video game, and not just about the video game, but about some of the tools and skills that you need to be good at that video game. And then you're going to dive into learning how to
mm,
do those skills better, and then you're going to apply it to that video game. So schools and industry, I'm sorry, but they're completely missing the point on what's really needed to solve problems. And that's why I wrote the book. And I would love to speak at those organizations and to help, not just the teachers and the managers, but really help the students and the employees understand that they can innovate too. They can come up with these $1 million, $1 billion ideas, but
mm.
they're not going to do it by getting the highest grade or getting the highest degree, right? Or going to the best college. I'm sorry. That's not how it works. And there's enough research out there to show that that's not where those are not measures of success. I mean, Einstein was in the patent office working as a, patent clerk in the patent office when he came up with the theory for relativity and everything, right? I think that's what it was. So that's why I wrote the book, to give the real insight to how innovation and creative problem solving
Mm,
really happens on the ground.
mm. Well, I definitely appreciate you. I think it kind of goes back to like your title I gave you, the inner circle boss. Because I mean, you're looking at things differently, right? That's the whole break out the box, but inside the box it may be a circle, but you're the circle within the
Mhm.
circle. Like you're like kind of more so the nucleus. And again, you're talking about generalities, but in that you're saying that this book can essentially help everyone and anyone, even though that you're specializing and talking more so in the medical, but it's more so the attributes of understanding innovation at its simplest form, and you're just using those as examples. So going to anyone that is looking to create software, to create a company, to create, even if you're going into politics, I see that there's purpose from this book. So to the listener,
Yeah,
if you have an opportunity, definitely pick up Kevin's book and let us know what you think.
definitely. You said it, creativity. That's innovation to me, and it applies anywhere. And that's why, these 7 areas, you can apply them anywhere. You don't have to do all 7, but the more you have, I think the more successful you will be. And it knows no age or background or anything. Anybody can do it. And yeah, you can read the book in an afternoon. That's how thin it is.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a small book, but it's an effective book. But I think as far as episodes, just we can go ahead and close it out, knowing that innovation is from your point of view and the collective point of view. It should be introduced as a way of living, not just a way of doing. Right? It should be a philosophy that integrates into everyone's lives, and that's what I'm really getting from your book.
I love that. That is right on target. You got it.
Cool, cool. Well, I definitely appreciate you, and obviously, I look forward to seeing what you're going to come up with next. I mean, because again, you're into innovation, so there's no telling. 6 months from now, you may have a whole new concept or some new patents coming out. So again, I love what you're doing, and I look forward to seeing what you're going to do next.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to spend this time with you today. Thank you.